50 here, Big 550 KTRS. Well, Ferguson is back in the news now that the legislature is holding, hearings. Eric Schmidt is a state senator, and he is also running for treasurer. He also sits on the board of Nurses for Newborns, so that's why we like him. Good morning, Mr. Eric Schmidt.
You know, McGraw, I would hope that you'd like me for other reasons, but I will take what I can get.
I like you
for newborns.
I don't like you for any reason except for the fact that you're a supporter of Nurses for Newborns.
Fair enough. I'll take what I can get.
And the second you're no longer a supporter, you'll have to deal with the wrath of the nurses and me. So
I know. I won't do that.
Okay, good. All right, fair enough. All right. So explain to people what this hearing is. Is this like those congressional hearings we see in Washington?
Well, it's an oversight committee, so I suppose in some ways there's oversight committees in Washington, but this is a joint committee that's existed for a long, long time. There's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats from each chamber, from the Senate and the House, and its charge is to sort of, look at things, do some sort of investigation as it arises. On this issue in particular, we were formed to look at the events, particularly in the when the non-indictment came down as it relates to the response, how the money was spent, number one, and number two, how on earth, when most people, could have assumed or predicted or even though hoped it wouldn't have happened that way, that if a non-indictment came down, some of the events that transpired could have been predicted, especially where they took place in Ferguson. How on earth the National Guard, once a state of emergency was declared for the specific purpose of activating the National Guard, that they were not on the streets of Ferguson that fateful night when one of our communities was burning. And so we began that process we had an organizational meeting in December, and then we had our first sort of hearing with testimony last night.
And then is this going to be every month, every week, every day? How long is this going to be?
I would imagine we'll have a couple more hearings. I mean, I think that what we had yesterday was the mayor of Ferguson, some of the first responders, the firefighters were there just to sort of understand what took place. And then I think we'll move on to some of the other decision makers because we're trying to find out who was in the room. And what's interesting, McGraw, about last night and the hearing that we had, the mayor of Ferguson never was in contact with the governor's office. At all. I mean, he reached out to other elected officials, but the governor's office never sort of kept him in the loop as to what was actually happening in the city. But the most shocking thing, I suppose, that came from last night was the firefighter testimony. The firefighters, so 2 weeks prior to the non-indictment happening, the plan was that the National Guard would be on the streets. Then, for some reason, 2 weeks before that happened, they were in quote-unquote a support role, so they weren't on the streets. As it turns out, they weren't even there. The National Guardsmen were not even anywhere near. They weren't in a background role. They weren't even there that night, even though they were in Clayton and downtown protecting life and property. The governor never activated them to be in Ferguson, but the firefighters, even that night, as they were going out to put out fires, were unaware that the National Guard wouldn't be there to help them. And so I just think, the decision-making process along the way here really was appalling, and we're trying to understand why decisions were made.
What about subpoena power? Can you get documents? Can you get emails?
Yes, we do. We have that authority, just as a court would. This joint committee has subpoena power, and so we last week issued a letter asking certain departments for correspondence. What, a good example of that would be, was there communication with Washington about what our plan would be locally? And what we found out last night was the Department of Justice was concerned about, quote-unquote, the optics of what it would look like to have the National Guard on the street. And I think there's a lot more for us to know here. And like I said, before on your show, I grew up there. I represent a large portion of St. Louis County. The idea that image of the President of the United States calling for calm with a split screen of police cars burning that night is a lasting image, a very, very unfortunate one. And we're trying to understand why there are 1,000 National Guardsmen in a building waiting to be called, and were never called.
Hold on a second. This is important because the White House has said that Governor Nixon was on the phone with Valerie Jarrett a number of times. How did we find out, or how did you find out, how did this committee find out that the White House was concerned about the optics?
So the mayor of Ferguson, his testimony last night was when I asked him, actually, how did you become aware that the National Guard would no longer be in Ferguson? There was a meeting when the decision was made about 2 weeks prior to non-indictment, where it was explained that the Department of Justice had concerns about the optics. That's all we know right now. So we haven't seen any correspondence to further illuminate that point, but they were involved at some point with the determination that now I think the governor in his press conference said it was his decision to not have them there, and sort of defended it, the fact that no one was killed. Well, you know, there are a lot of people's dreams and businesses that went up in flames that night. And as you recall, McGraw, the next night when the National Guard was on the streets, nothing really happened. And so why on earth wouldn't that have taken place when we knew the potential for this unrest would have happened that first night? Why weren't they there? And if it's just about optics, I just don't think that's a very good reason.
Eric, will you have the governor? Will you guys be able to question him?
We have that. Yes, we have that ability. We have that power to ask the governor to come and testify. I would like to see him come before that committee and just answer questions. Well, time will tell if he's willing to do that.
Okay, you have the power, but are you going to use that power?
I think we will. I think we will ask the governor at some point to come before that committee and answer these really pretty basic questions, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And there's probably, I hope that he does, because this process can be so much more, it doesn't need to be anything other than the legislature, which is what we're supposed to do, ask questions in this balance of power, this checks and balances that we have, ask the executive why decisions were made. I mean, the state of Missouri, local authorities are spending millions of dollars in this response. And I think it's fair for the people to know, the people that elected all of us to know, why the chief executive of the state didn't have the National Guard on the streets when he activated them, presumably for that specific reason. So it's my hope that we won't get involved in a legal battle if we ask the governor to appear.
Have you had any problems with the administration getting any of the emails or anything this committee wants?
That letter just went out very recently. So, again, that's an opportunity, I think, for the governor to cooperate with the legislature and provide the information that's being requested. It's not, and hopefully it's not a document dump where they just
give you 8
boxes
billion.
and boxes.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're responsive and get us what we're looking for.
I think your question, and we played the clip earlier in the hour of the following morning, he calls for more National Guard, and this violence will not stand. And so he's telling two different stories. One story, he's saying, we don't want trained killers on the streets facing off with unarmed citizens. And then the next day, he calls up more National Guard and puts them in place. So which is it, Governor?
McGraw, the other thing is, I've heard that, and I've read a couple headlines today about this trained killer comment. I mean, these are men and women in uniform. That reference to me makes no sense. In fact, there was a press conference prior to the non-indictment where the governor said the National Guard was trained for this specific purpose, to keep the peace that night. So I don't understand that comment, and I think it's him trying to justify a decision that I don't think was a good one, and I want to understand why he made that decision. And I will just tell you honestly, we had a sense of what the mayor might say. We knew that the governor really hadn't communicated with him, but the fact that these firefighters from Eureka and Pattonville that were responding came before that committee and said, we didn't know that we were called to protect these businesses and like in our job, and there were bullets flying over our head before we knew that we weren't going to have help. That lack of communication with first responders, people putting their lives on the line, to me is appalling, and I don't understand it.
That's Eric Schmitt, who is running for state treasurer, and he is currently a Missouri state senator. Eric Schmitt, we'll have you back as much as you guys want to come back. When is the next hearing?
I would imagine it would be within the next month. I mean, we're going to try to follow up on the information we found out last night, get those documents that were requested, and have a hearing hopefully in the next few weeks.
Eric Schmitt, thanks for checking in.
Take care, guys.
You got it. 7:58 here. St. Louis Cloud.